The last light of the old gods. The sun over the Tyrrhenian Sea did not rise, it was conjured. It spilled first over the dark, pine-clad peaks, catching the dew on the sacred groves of the Etruscans, before sliding down the slopes to gild the tiled roofs of Veii. In the house of Lars Velcha, a nobleman of the city, the light found the face of his young daughter, Vanna, as she traced the faded murals on the courtyard wall, dancing figures with almond eyes, leopards, and gods whose names were secrets whispered only by the haruspecs, the liver readers. The air smelled of baking bread, crushed oregano, and the profound, unshakable certainty that the world had always been, and would always be, this way. To the north, beyond the snow-capped Alps where the air grew thin and sharp, a different sun awoke a different people. Among the Insabras, a Celtic tribe, the dawn was a time for sharpening iron and breathing mist into the cold air. Bren Nos, a chieftain whose torque of twisted gold was as heavy as his responsibilities, watched his people stir. Their world was one of oak forests and shifting alliances, of epic songs sung in halls heavy with smoke and mead. They looked south, where the tales said the wine flowed like water and the cities groaned with gold. It was a pressure, a hunger, a slow, tectonic yearning that pushed against the old boundaries of the world. And to the south, across the wine-dark sea, the sun was a ledger. In the great harbor of Carthage, the light gleamed on the bronze rams of countless warships and illuminated the bustling agora where merchants from 100 ports haggled in a dozen tongues. Here, the air was thick with salt, cumin, and the scent of power. The city, a testament to the goddess Tanit and the god Baal Hammon, was a machine of commerce and control. Its senators, men like the Admiral Hanno, did not dream of gods in groves or glory in battle, they dreamed of contracts, of trade winds, and of a Mediterranean that was, by divine right and naval supremacy, a Carthaginian lake. These three worlds, the mystical Etruscans, the vital Celts, the calculating Carthaginians, were the pillars of the West. They brushed against one another in moments of tense trade. A Greek merchant, his ship laden with amber from the Baltic and tin from Cornwall, might sell his wares in the smoky hall of a Celtic king, who paid with gold mined from rivers his people had sacred for generations. That same gold might later be fashioned into a pendant in an Etruscan workshop in the city of Caira, only to be purchased by a Carthaginian agent, eventually finding its way into a temple treasury as an offering for a safe voyage. It was a world of breathtaking diversity, a tapestry woven with threads of iron, gold, and faith. But as Thana looked up from the mural, a faint, unfamiliar chill touched her spine. It was not the wind from the north, nor the sea breeze from the south. It was a whisper, a rumor from a cluster of 7 villages by a river called the Tiber. It was the shadow of a wolf, not yet full-grown, but already tasting the air, its eyes reflecting the last, brilliant light of the old gods, waiting for its moment to descend from the hills. The light in Etruria was different. It was not the harsh, revealing glare of the Greek islands, nor the heavy, bronze-domed glow of the Egyptian delta. It was a soft, hazy gold, filtered through the leaves of ancient oaks and the smoke of offering fires that coiled from rock-cut altars deep within the sacred groves. This was the light that fell upon the cities of the Ravenna, the people whom the Greeks would call Tyrannoi and the Romans, Etrusi. Their world was not one of stark, philosophical clarity, but of profound and intimate mystery, a continuous, trembling dialogue between the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. To stand on the Acropolis of Veii at dawn was to understand that the city was not merely a collection of houses and temples, but a living entity, its foundations sunk not just into tufa rock, but into the very will of the gods. The walls, massive blocks of stone fitted without mortar, seemed less built than grown, an outcrop of the land's own power. From this vantage point, the world unfolded as a sacred map. Every gully, every spring, every strangely shaped stone held meaning. The flight of an eagle was not a random event but a sentence written in the sky by Tinia, the Sky Father. The liver of a sacrificed sheep, laid bare on a bronze model marked with the celestial regions, was a terrain of portent, its lobes and fissures a direct message from the divine. The Etruscan people were the masters of this discipline of interpretation, the Disciplina Etrusca, a vast and intricate body of knowledge revealed to them in the mythic past by a childlike seer, Tejas, who had sprung from a furrow in a field near Tarquinio. This was not a religion of hope or salvation, but one of precise, contractual navigation. The universe was a carefully ordered, yet perilous, place, and the role of humanity was to discern the gods' will and align with it, to maintain the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, through exact ritual and fervent observance. This spiritual sophistication was mirrored by a material culture of breathtaking vitality and luxury. The Etruscan elite did not inhabit a world of austere virtue, they reveled in a sensory paradise. Their tombs, carved to mimic their earthly homes, were painted with scenes of feasting, dancing, and athletic games, vibrant with ochre, red, black, and Egyptian blue. Here, in the silent, airless chambers beneath the earth, banquetiers reclined on brightly painted couches, their bodies strong and graceful, their faces animated by a confident, almost insolent joy. Men and women dined together, a fact that shocked their Greek neighbors, the women often named on the frescoes and sarcophagi with their own lineage, possessing a social prominence that was unthinkable elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The artifacts that filled these tombs spoke of a culture at the crossroads of the world. Gold fibulae of exquisite filigree work, finer than anything yet seen in Italy, held their fine woolen robes. Bronze mirrors, polished to a liquid sheen, were engraved on the back with scenes from Greek mythology, a knowing, sophisticated appropriation of foreign tales, filtered through a distinctly Etruscan sensibility. They drank wine from delicate Athenian kylixes, but mixed it in local bocchero ware, a pottery so dense and grey it mimicked the sheen of polished metal, a technical innovation that was theirs alone. Their wealth was dug from the earth of the Colline Metallifere, the metal-bearing hills, where mines of copper, iron, and tin provided the raw materials for an industrial and artistic revolution. It was the Etruscans who controlled the iron of Elba, and it was this metal, forged into tools, weapons, and trade goods, that formed the backbone of their power. Their 12, or perhaps 15, city-states, the Duodecim Populi, formed a loose religious and military league, from the northern outpost of Felsina, Bologna, to the southern capitals of Veii and Caira, a stone's throw from the nascent village of Rome. Each city was fiercely independent, ruled by its locumones, its priest-kings. And aristocratic families, yet bound to the others by shared language, shared rights, and a shared identity as the Ravenna. The landscape they dominated was not a unified empire but a constellation of powerful, hilltop citadels, their territories defined by the sacred boundaries of rivers and mountains. The sea was not a barrier but their domain, they were the great pirates and traders of the Tyrrhenian, their ships challenging the Phoenicians and Greeks for supremacy. It was they who founded a settlement at the iron-rich island of Pithecusae, and from their ports of Perge and Populonia, they exported iron, bronze goods, and amber north to the Celts and south to the Greeks and Carthaginians, creating a vast commercial network that fed their prosperity and disseminated their culture. The sound of their world was a symphony of industry and devotion, the clang of the smith's hammer in Populonia, where the fires of the forges lit the night sky and the slag piles grew into small mountains, the rhythmic chant of the haruspex as he scrutinized the divine will in the entrails of a sacrifice, the laughter and music from a symposium where the air was thick with the scent of wine and spiced cakes, the solemn silence of a tomb being sealed, its occupant equipped for an eternal journey. That mirrored the life they had so passionately enjoyed. This was the Etruscan zenith, a moment of perfect, poised balance. They were not a people looking toward a future glory, they were living within it, at the very apex of their cultural and spiritual confidence. They had tamed the land, decoded the heavens, and created a civilization of profound depth and dazzling beauty, a world where the sacred and the sensual were inextricably woven together. The future was a distant, unimportant rumor. The present was a feast, a ritual, a vibrant, colorful fresco capturing a moment of perfect joy, forever poised between the dark, fertile earth and the brilliant, God-filled sky. They were the masters of Italy, their influence stretching from the Po Valley to Campania, and in their art, their religion, and their very bearing, there was a sense of permanence, as if their way of life, so deeply connected to the rhythms of the land and the gods, was as eternal as the hills upon which they built their mighty, unwalled cities. They could not conceive that the greatest threat would not come from the sophisticated Greeks to the south or the mighty Carthaginians across the sea, but from a small, austere, and ruthlessly ambitious people living in crude huts on the hills across the Tiber, a people who watched them with a mixture of envy, awe, and a cold, calculating hunger, a people who would one day learn all their sacred arts, of divination, of city building, of war, and turn that knowledge against its masters, draining the color from their world and reducing their vibrant, passionate songs to a silent, scholarly curiosity. But that was a shadow yet unseen. For now, in the golden light of a Tyrrhenian afternoon, the world was theirs, and it was enough. The world of the Etruscans, for all its deep-rooted mystery and terrestrial power, was not a closed system. It existed within a wider Europe that was itself in motion, a continent breathing, its rhythms set not by the meticulous rituals of liver readers but by the older, more brutal pulse of migration and hunger. From the great, trackless forests of the north, from the lands where the oak and the beech grew so thick that the sun was a rumor on the forest floor, a pressure was building. It was a force that would not be decoded by a bronze model of a sheep's liver, for it was not a message from the gods but a simple, tectonic fact of human need. This was the world of the Celts, or as they would have known themselves in those centuries before a common name bound them, a myriad of related peoples, the Boii, the Insubres, the Senans, the Lingwans. Their story in this era is not one of cities and written treaties, but of the long, slow creep of a people, a cultural tide washing against the stone walls of the Mediterranean world. The catalyst was likely a confluence of simple, profound forces, a shift in climate bringing colder, wetter winters to the north, the exhaustion of the thin soil they farmed with slash-and-burn techniques, or perhaps just the inherent momentum of a successful, warrior aristocratic society whose very structure demanded expansion, new lands for younger sons, new sources of tribute and glory. Whatever the precise cause, the effect was a gradual, relentless southward drift, a seepage of people and culture through the high passes of the Alps, following the great river valleys like the Po and the Danube, a human glacier of immense, if slow-moving, power. To understand this influx is to abandon the notion of a single, organized army on the march, though that would come later in the terrifying form of Brennus and his sack of Rome. This earlier phase was more organic, more insidious. It was not an invasion but a settling, the way water finds cracks in stone, freezes, and widens them. Small, kinship-based warrior bands, leading their families, their wagons, and their livestock, would cross the mountains, not as conquerors but as settlers seeking Lebensraum, living space. They would first occupy the marginal lands, the hills overlooking the fertile plains already claimed by the Etruscans in the region they called Cisalpine Gaul. An Etruscan merchant traveling the well-worn trade route from the Po Valley south to Fulcina might, over a generation, notice a subtle change. First, it would be a new settlement on a previously uninhabited hilltop, a cluster of sturdy, thatched-roof longhouses surrounded by a palisade of sharpened logs, different from the Etruscan style. Then, he might see new faces in the market, tall men with fair skin and hair bleached with lime water into shocking white spikes, their mustaches flowing over their lips, their torsos adorned with heavy torques of twisted gold, their eyes assessing the Etruscan goods with a cool, confident avarice. They were not hostile, not at first. They were potential trading partners, customers for Etruscan wine and bronze vessels, which they coveted with a passion, and suppliers of the amber, furs, and salt from the north that the Mediterranean world desired. This initial contact was likely one of cautious, mutually beneficial exchange. The Etruscans, from their established cities like Melpum and Fulcina, saw these newcomers as another barbarian market to be exploited, a new vein of wealth to be tapped. But the cultural force the Celts represented was fundamentally antithetical to the Etruscan world order. Where the Etruscans sought to impose a sacred, divinely sanctioned order upon the landscape, the Celtic relationship with the world was one of raw, untamed power and numinous presence. Their gods were not distant figures to be appeased with precise ritual but were immanent in the gnarled oak, the thunderous waterfall, the deep, still pool in the forest. A druid, the Celtic intellectual and spiritual counterpart to the Haruspex, did not need a temple, the whole of the natural world was his sanctuary. His power came not from a codified text but from memorized lore, from years of secret training in the forest, from a deep, intuitive connection to the forces of life and death. This was a spirituality of the wild, and it produced a society that celebrated individual martial prowess above all else. Status was not inherited through a static, urban aristocracy but was constantly won and lost through feats of arms and the distribution of lavish gifts. A chieftain's power rested on his ability to provide for his warband, his comitatus, to lead them to victory and plunder, and to be more generous than his rivals. This created a society that was inherently expansive and volatile, a pressure cooker of martial ambition that, when its internal tensions could no longer be contained, would vent its steam outward, toward the softer, richer lands to the south. The objects they cherished tell this story. While an Etruscan noble's tomb held finely painted pottery, engraved mirrors, and delicate gold jewelry, a Celtic chieftain's grave was a statement of raw, metallic power. He was buried with his chariot, his iron sword, long, slashing weapons designed for open combat, not the stabbing gladius of the later Romans, his spear, and his great shield of wood and leather, often adorned with a fearsome bronze boss. His personal adornment was not subtle, it was a display of wealth meant to be seen and understood instantly, massive gold torques around the neck, thick armlets, and rings. These were not just ornaments, they were the physical manifestation of his honor, his status, and his wealth, the very currency of his society. To give such gifts to his followers was to bind them to him, to take them in battle was to absorb the enemy's power and prestige. This was a culture that produced sublime, abstract art, beautifully crafted metalwork swirling with triskels and flowing, vegetal forms that seemed to capture the very energy of life, but it was art in the service of war and status. The contrast with the Etruscan aesthetic, which so often depicted the human form in moments of civilized pleasure, could not have been more stark. The initial trickle of this Celtic presence, therefore, began to alter the very fabric of the Po Valley. The Etruscan cities, which had grown wealthy and confident, found their northern frontier changing. The new settlements multiplied. Trade began to be supplemented by raids. A farmstead too far from the walls of Felsina might be found burned, its Etruscan occupants gone, their place taken by a Celtic family. It was a slow, inexorable process of cultural and demographic replacement. The Etruscan city-states, for all their league, were politically fragmented and often in competition with one another. They lacked the unity or the will to see this not as a series of local incidents but as a fundamental, existential threat. They were like a great, old tree, its roots deep in the soil, its branches heavy with fruit, failing to notice the saplings growing up around its base, saplings that would eventually choke its light and drain its soil. The Celts were not trying to conquer the Etruscan civilization in the way a modern army seeks to capture a capital, they were simply moving in, drawn by the fertility of the land and the magnetic pull of its wealth. They were the embodiment of a different kind of time, not the cyclical, ritual time of the Etruscans, nor the linear, ambitious time that would later characterize Rome, but the vast, slow time of a people on the move, the time of generations and migrations. Their warriors, schooled in single combat and the heady rush of the cattle raid, looked down from their hill forts onto the tidy, vineyard-clad slopes of the Etruscan estates and saw not a sacred order but a prize, a world of abundance that was, in their worldview, there for the taking by the strong and the brave. The Etruscan Pax Deorum meant nothing to a people whose gods were the gods of the wild place, the storm, and the blade. The tension built with the imperceptible but irresistible force of a continental plate shifting, a grinding, colossal pressure that would, in time, shatter the northern pillar of the Etruscan world and send tremors that would be felt all the way to the 7 hills of Rome, a warning of the storm of iron and fire that was brewing in the north. The Carthaginian reality was a deliberate and brutalist architecture of power, a system of such calculated, mercantile genius that it stood in stark, chilling contrast to the organic mysticism of the Etruscans and the vital, chaotic energy of the Celts. It was born not from a dream of gods and groves or a warrior's thirst for glory, but from a simple, stark necessity, the survival of a people who had fled the ashes of Tyre, carrying with them not just their gods but the trauma of displacement and a ferocious, unshakable resolve to never be victims again. This foundational memory of exile was the forge in which the Carthaginian character was tempered, creating a people for whom sentiment was a luxury and control the only true divinity.
Their city, Carthaginian, the new city, was a statement of intent from its very foundation, a fortress built on an easily defensible peninsula, with its back to the African continent and its face, its soul, its entire being, turned relentlessly toward the sea. The sea was not a mystery to be revered but a highway to be dominated, a blank space on which to inscribe their ledger of power. Their world was not one of sacred landscapes but of strategic choke points, of sheltered harbors, of island stepping stones leading to the sources of wealth. Theirs was an empire of the between space, the merchant's ark, and its foundation was a bargain, not with man, but with their gods, a covenant of utter devotion in exchange for unassailable power. This divine contract was the bedrock of everything, and it was a relationship of terrifying clarity. The chief deities of Carthage were not capricious Olympians to be wooed with poetry or athletic games, they were Baal-Hamon, the lord of the furnace, whose face was the merciless sun that baked North Africa, and his consort Tanit, the face of Baal, who evolved from a celestial goddess into a pervasive, almost omnipresent symbol of the state itself, her sign, a stylized woman, a triangle, and a disc, stamped on every public building, every treaty, every soldier's pay. The most profound and horrifying expression of this pact was the practice of the moke, the sacrifice. In times of existential crisis, a plague, a military disaster, the threat of invasion, the city would offer its most precious possession to secure divine favor, its firstborn sons. The accounts, though filtered through hostile Roman and Greek sources, are too persistent to ignore, and archaeology in the Tophet, the sacred precinct, reveals urn after urn of charred infant bones, buried beneath stone markers dedicated to Baal-Hamon and Tanit. This was not the madness of a mob but a state-sanctioned, ritualized act of supreme commitment. It was the ultimate logic of their worldview, to ensure the survival and prosperity of the whole, no price was too high. This theological calculus, this willingness to pay the ultimate premium, bled into every facet of Carthaginian life, creating a society that was supremely pragmatic, resilient, and capable of a cold, strategic patience that could outlast any adversary. It was a society that understood cost-benefit analysis in its most visceral, spiritual form. This ethos of the calculated exchange manifested most brilliantly in their political and economic system. Carthage was an oligarchic republic, but one governed not by landowning aristocrats seeking glory, but by a council of elders and a body of judges, the Sephites, drawn from the wealthiest merchant families. Their power was not measured in acres of land or lineages traced to heroes, but in the size of their commercial fleets, the diversity of their trading portfolios, the fullness of the state treasury. The state itself functioned like a colossal, multinational corporation. It did not seek to conquer and assimilate vast land empires, as Rome later would, it sought to establish a monopoly. Its goal was to control the flows of trade, not the peoples who generated it. They established a network of colonies and trading posts, emporia, that stretched from the coast of Libya to the Atlantic shores of Morocco and Spain, and north to Sardinia, Sicily, and the Balearic Islands. Each of these was not a colony of citizens seeking a new life, but a fortified warehouse, a naval base, a logistical node. They were outposts of control, designed to secure resources and deny them to rivals. The most legendary of these ventures were the vast maritime expeditions down the Atlantic coast of Africa, commissioned by the council not for exploration's sake, but to bypass the Greek-controlled straits and tap directly into the sources of gold and exotic goods. The Admiral Hanno's voyage, with its 60 ships and thousands of colonists, was a state-funded corporate expansion, a breathtaking act of commercial daring. The military expression of this philosophy was the most efficient and ruthless fighting machine the world had yet seen, because it was built on the same principle of outsourcing and specialization that governed their commerce. The citizen of Carthage was a merchant, a sailor, a politician, a priest. He was not, by default, a soldier. To send a citizen to die in a land battle was a poor return on investment when his skills were more valuable in the counting house or the Senate. Instead, Carthage perfected the art of the mercenary army. They became the supreme managers of violence, the contractors of death. From the fierce Numidian horsemen of North Africa, the most skilled light cavalry in the ancient world, they purchased speed and terror. From the highlands of Iberia, they hired stoic, formidable infantrymen who fought with the deadly falcata,
a curved sword that could shear through a Roman shield. From the Balearic Islands, they enlisted slingers whose lead pellets could crack a skull at 100 paces. This was a military composed of specialist modules, each hired for a specific tactical purpose. It was an army with no native loyalty, no cause beyond its pay, and this was its greatest strength and its ultimate weakness. It gave Carthaginian generals a flexible, professional tool, but it was a tool that had to be paid, and paid promptly. A Carthaginian army in the field was a walking financial liability, its loyalty as secure as the last shipment of silver from the mines of Spain. This system reached its apotheosis in the Barca family, particularly Hamilcar and his son Hannibal, who would essentially use Spain as a private corporate fief to fund their personal war against Rome, a war fought not with Carthaginian farmers but with a multi-ethnic, paid consortium of the world's finest warriors. The Carthaginian aesthetic reflected this singular focus. There was no Parthenon, no soaring ziggurat seeking the heavens. Their architecture was functional, formidable, and opulent in a way that spoke of accumulated wealth, not artistic inspiration. The great circular inner harbor of Carthage, when it was built, was a masterpiece of military engineering, an artificial island surrounded by hundreds of shipsheds where the state's warships, the quinquiremes that were the dreadnoughts of the ancient world, were stored and maintained. It was a machine for projecting naval power. Their homes, excavated in the ruins, show lavish mosaics and rich furnishings, but the art itself was largely derivative, an assemblage of Egyptian, Greek, and Phoenician motifs, a cosmopolitan pastiche that reflected their role as cultural middlemen rather than artistic innovators. They produced no Homer, no Sophocles. Their genius was for the contract, the ledger, the ship's design, the harbor's blueprint. They were the supreme realists of the ancient world, a civilization that had looked into the abyss of extinction and had decided that the only thing that mattered was survival, and that survival was a function of control, and control was purchased with gold and blood. They stood as a dark mirror to the emerging Roman Republic, a rival model of empire, one based on the incorporation of peoples and the relentless expansion of citizenship, the other based on the management of networks and the cold, precise calculus of profit and loss. They watched the Etruscan decline and the Celtic ferment not with the eyes of a poet or a prophet, but with the eyes of an executive assessing market instability, calculating how to turn the chaos of others into their own enduring, and dearly bought, security. The world did not fracture in a single, cataclysmic battle, not yet. The great collision of these three distinct realities, the Etruscan, the Celtic, and the Carthaginian, first occurred not on a battlefield, but in the liminal, pragmatic space of commerce, a tense and fragile moment where the deep structures of these civilizations brushed against one another, revealing both the possibility of a shared world and the deep, irreconcilable fissures that would ultimately tear it apart. This fracturing was a slow, cultural weathering, a process as subtle and inexorable as water seeping into the cracks of a monument, freezing and thawing until the stone itself crumbles. The stage for this silent drama was often a neutral ground, a trading post like the one at Spina on the Adriatic coast, or the bustling, cosmopolitan port of Pergi, the sacred harbor of the Etruscan city of Caira. Here, on a day indistinguishable from any other in the grand tally of years, the full, dizzying complexity of the pre-Roman Mediterranean was made manifest, a living tapestry of interconnected yet profoundly alien worlds. The air in Pergi was a thick soup of smells, the sharp tang of salt and drying fish, the rich odor of pitch being applied to a ship's hull, the sweet, heavy scent of incense drifting from the twin temples, one Etruscan, one strangely, dedicated to the Phoenician goddess Astarte, a testament to an earlier, more cordial understanding with the Carthaginian world. The sounds were a cacophony of languages, the guttural Etruscan of the local merchants, the melodic Greek of a trader from Syracuse, the strange, consonant-heavy Punic of a Carthaginian agent, and the newer, harsher tones of Celtic, spoken by tall, fair-haired chieftains from the north who had come down to the sea, drawn by the magnetic pull of its goods. It was here that the three pillars of the West met in the person of their representatives. There was Velmestarna, a young Etruscan noble from the powerful family that ruled Caira, his tunic of fine white linen, his bearing one of innate, unshakable superiority born of 1,000 years of rootedness. He was there to oversee the shipment of Etruscan iron ingots, the product of the mines at Populonia, and to acquire Attic pottery and Egyptian glass for his father's tomb. His world was one of prescribed ritual and deep, terrestrial power. He looked upon the bustling port with a sense of ownership, as if the very waves that lapped against the quay did so with the permission of his city's gods. Across the crowded wharf stood a man of a different order. He was a Carthaginian, not a mere merchant sailor but a Rab Kohanim, a commercial magistrate, his name long lost, but his function clear. He was a servant of the Council of 104, his purpose to assess, to negotiate, to control. He wore a simple, unadorned robe of good quality, but his eyes missed nothing, calculating the tonnage of the ships, the quality of the goods, the shifting allegiances in the faces of the traders. He was there to acquire that very Etruscan iron, to ensure it did not fall into the hands of the Greeks of Syracuse, and to pay for it with Spanish silver, the lifeblood of Carthaginian power. For him, Perge was not a sacred city, it was a node in a network, a variable in a complex equation of maritime dominance. His loyalty was not to a place, but to a system, the vast, mercantile empire that was Carthage. And then there was the third man, the new element that was altering the old equations. He was Brennos, a chieftain of the Senans, a Celtic tribe that had now firmly established itself in the Po Valley, displacing the Etruscan inhabitants of Felsina. He stood a head taller than most around him, his hair stiffened with lime into a savage white crest, his great, drooping mustache framing a mouth set in a line of cool appraisal. Around his neck lay a torque of pure gold, thick as a man's thumb, its ends fashioned into stylized bowls. He was accompanied by a handful of his warriors, their presence causing a subtle ripple of unease through the crowd. They were not here as supplicants. They were here as players, their wagons laden with amber from the Baltic, with furs from the deep German forests, with salt from the mines of the Alps. But more than that, they brought a new kind of energy, a restless, martial confidence that stood in stark contrast to the established, almost ritualized rhythms of Mediterranean trade. Brennos was not interested in delicate glass or painted pottery. His eyes were fixed on the wine, the great amphorae from Greece and Etruria, and on the bronze, stacks of cauldrons and helmets and weapons. For his people, wine was not a mere beverage, it was a sacred intoxicant, a key to the otherworld, a substance of such power that it was worth a fortune in amber and slaves. And bronze was the material of status, to be melted down and reforged into the great flagons and wine-serving equipment that would be the centerpiece of his feasting hall, symbols of his power and generosity. The trading that ensued was a microcosm of the collision of worlds. Velmastarna, the Etruscan, treated the exchange with a kind of patrician disdain, a transaction between a civilized man and a barbarian, necessary for profit but beneath his cultural station. He offered his iron with the air of a man bestowing a favor. The Carthaginian magistrate was all cold precision. He examined the ingots, tested their quality, and haggled with a relentless, dispassionate logic. He saw the Celts not as noble savages, but as a new market, a new source of raw materials, and a potential military problem to be managed. But it was the interaction between the Carthaginian and the Celt, Brennos, that was most revealing. They did not share a language, communicating through a pidgin of Greek and gesture. The Carthaginian offered silver coin, the universal currency of his world, a symbol of abstract, portable value. Brennos looked at the stamped metal with contempt. He hefted it, bit it, but his eyes showed no understanding of its true power. He pointed instead to the bronze cauldrons, to the wine. He dealt in tangible wealth, in objects that held inherent, immediate value and social meaning. The exchange was successful, but it was a conversation between two different universes of value. The Carthaginian left with his amber, a commodity he could sell for a vast profit in the markets of the East, having offloaded a surplus of Spanish silver. Brennos left with his wine and bronze, his status among his people elevated, his warriors drunk on the promise of the new power they could wield. In that moment, the beauty and the tragedy of the pre-Roman world were held in a fragile balance. It was a world of astonishing diversity, where a chieftain from the northern forests could barter with a representative of a pan-Mediterranean corporate state in the sacred port of a native Italian civilization. There was a vibrant, chaotic potential in such a meeting, the possibility of a world that would evolve into a hybrid of these three powerful strains. But for those with the eyes to see, the cracks were already visible. Velmastarna, watching the Celts depart with their loot, felt a cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. These were not the manageable, if troublesome, neighbors of old. They were a people who did not understand the sacred boundaries, who moved with a disconcerting freedom. The Carthaginian magistrate, already on his ship, was updating his mental ledger. The Etruscan cities of the north were weakening, their hold on the Po Valley slipping. This required a recalculation. Perhaps a direct understanding with these new Celtic powers would be more profitable than propping up the fading Etruscan order. It was the birth of Realpolitik in the western Mediterranean. And Brennos, riding north with his wagons groaning under their new wealth, carried back more than just wine and bronze. He carried a new understanding. The stories of the southern lands were true. They were rich, they were soft, and their gods, for all their temples and rituals, had not protected them from a determined people with strong swords. The allure of the south was no longer just a tale, it was a memory, a tangible reality, and a plan taking shape. The trade that had just concluded was not an end, but a beginning. It was a reconnaissance, a testing of the waters. The fragile moment of exchange had revealed the profound differences in spirit, in value, in ambition. The old world, the world of the Etruscans, was the fixed point in the center, but it was being pressed upon from the north by a raw, vital force and from the sea by a cool, calculating intelligence. The equilibrium was breaking. The trade goods were the vectors of this change, the peaceful forerunners of the storm of iron that was to come, the quiet, commercial prelude to the scream of the charging Celt and the silent, relentless advance of the Roman legionary. The shadow was at first so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it was lost in the brilliant, competing lights of the three great civilizations. It was a whisper on the wind from a place of no consequence, a rumor carried by shepherds and peddlers traveling the ancient salt routes that ran along the spine of Italy. To the Etruscan noble in his hilltop city, the Lucumo ruling from his throne in Tarquinia, the reports from the north about the Celtic pressure were a concern, a matter for military levies and fortified borders. The intelligence from his agents in the south, about Carthaginian ships dominating the Straits of Sicily, was a matter for diplomatic maneuvering and perhaps a sacrifice to Uni, his version of Juno, for favorable winds. But the stories from the central hills, from a collection of 7 villages clustered around a swampy ford on the Tiber River, were not even worth the time of a junior magistrate. They were a local matter, a squabble among Latins, a people the Etruscans had long since subdued and culturally dominated. For generations, the Etruscan kings of the Tarquin dynasty had actually ruled there, bringing the gifts of their civilization to the rude inhabitants of those hills, the art of divination, the concept of a city with temples and a forum. Rome was, in its infancy, a cultural and political satellite of Etruria, a backwater frontier town. Its people were a rough mix of Latins, Sabines, and others, their lives hard, their ambitions seemingly limited to their next harvest and their petty wars with neighboring towns like Alba Longa. Yet, it was in this very obscurity, in this harsh and unglamorous existence, that the seeds of a terrifyingly different kind of power were being sown. While the Etruscan aristocrat derived his authority from his connection to the gods and the ancient lineage of his family, and the Celtic chieftain from his personal prowess and his generosity with plunder, and the Carthaginian magistrate from his control of commercial capital, the Roman man's identity was being forged in a crucible of collective discipline and desperate survival. The Roman spirit was not one of joyful celebration like the Etruscans, nor of wild individual glory like the Celts, nor of calculated profit like the Carthaginians. It was a spirit of utter, unyielding duty, pietas, to the family, to the clan, and above all, to the abstract concept of the republic, the residential publica, the public thing. This was not a grand philosophy but a brutal, practical necessity. Hemmed in by more powerful neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, the warlike hill tribes of the Equi and Volsci to the east and south, the Romans developed a society that was, in essence, a permanent army camp. Their entire social and political structure, the complex hierarchy of patricians and plebeians, was organized for war and integration. The story of the Horatii triplets fighting to the death against the Curatii of Alba Longa to settle a conflict without full-scale war was a foundational myth that perfectly encapsulated their worldview. The individual was nothing, the state was everything. Victory was all that mattered, and it was to be achieved by any means necessary, with a grim, unsentimental focus. This produced a unique and terrifying plasticity. The Romans possessed a genius not for original creation, but for ruthless, efficient adoption and adaptation. They saw the Etruscan manipular legion, a flexible formation, and they perfected it, stripping it of its aristocratic flourishes and turning it into a machine of standardized, replaceable parts. They encountered the Celtic long sword and, recognizing its power in a slashing melee, they would later adopt its superior design while forging it with their own superior iron and discipline. They observed the Carthaginian quinquereme and, when a wrecked one fell into their hands, they reverse-engineered it with a breathtaking lack of pride, building an entire fleet from scratch in 60 days, adding their own brutal innovation, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned a naval battle of maneuver into an infantry fight on water, a fight they knew they could win. This was the shadow taking form, a culture with no sacred, immutable core beyond the will to power, a people who could learn everything from their enemies and then use that knowledge to systematically destroy them. They were the ultimate realists in a world still partially governed by myth and tradition. The first true rumble of this gathering storm, the moment the shadow began to lengthen and touch the other great powers, was the Roman expulsion of their last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, and the founding of the Republic. This was not merely a change of government, it was a declaration of a new kind of political organism, one based on shared citizenship, however limited at first, and a ferocious love of liberty, a liberty defined as freedom from the rule of a monarch, which made them fanatical in their defense of their state. The Etruscan League, accustomed to viewing Rome as a subject city, reacted with outrage. The story of Lars Porsena of Clusium attacking Rome to restore the Tarquins is shrouded in legend, but the truth it contains is vital. Whether the Romans heroically held the bridge defended by Horatius Cockles or, as some accounts suggest, were forced to submit, the outcome was the same: the Etruscans failed to reassert control. The Roman spirit had already hardened into something that would not be easily resubjugated. This was the first crack in the Etruscan edifice, and the Romans, now a sovereign republic, began to look outwards with a cold, acquisitive gaze. Their gaze fell first and most naturally on their Etruscan kin and former masters. The great Etruscan city of Veii, just a dozen miles north of Rome, was a jewel, its territory fertile, its position commanding the lower Tiber. What followed was not a single battle but a decade-long siege, a war of attrition that demonstrated the Roman talent for relentless, grinding warfare. For 10 years, while the Etruscan League dithered, unable to unite effectively behind Veii, the Romans maintained the pressure. They innovated in siegecraft, they tunneled under the city walls, and they never, ever gave up. The final fall of Veii was a catastrophe for Etruria. It was not just the loss of a powerful city, it was the demonstration that the old world, with its sacred boundaries and aristocratic rivalries, could not withstand the new, focused, and totalizing will of the Roman state. The Romans slaughtered the men of Veii, enslaved the women and children, and carried the statue of the city's patron goddess, Juno Regina, back to Rome in a ritual of evocatio, calling out, inviting the very deity of their conquered foe to abandon her city and take up residence in Rome. This was more than plunder, it was a spiritual annexation, a claiming of the enemy's divine power for their own. It showed an understanding of warfare that was psychological and theological, as well as military. The Etruscans, for all their deep knowledge of the gods, were horrified by this pragmatic sacrilege. The shadow had consumed its first major victim, and in doing so, it had grown larger, darker, and infinitely more hungry. And as this was happening, the other great powers began to take note, but through the distorted lens of their own worldviews. The Carthaginians, ever the pragmatists, saw the rising power and moved to codify it. They signed the first treaty with Rome, a document recorded by the historian Polybius, which carved up spheres of commercial influence. To the Carthaginian Senate, this was simply good business. They were recognizing a new local power in central Italy, a power that could be useful in keeping the Greeks of Magna Graecia in check. They did not see an existential threat, they saw a potential business partner, a useful, if crude, mercenary force on land. They completely misread the Roman character, believing that all peoples could be bound by the same logic of contract and profit that governed their own world. They failed to see that for Rome, a treaty was not a permanent settlement but a temporary expedient, a breathing space to consolidate before the next advance. The Celts, meanwhile, felt the pressure more immediately. The Roman expansion northward into Etruria was bringing their world into direct contact with this new force. And then the storm broke. A Celtic warband of the Senans, perhaps drawn by the news of the chaos following the fall of Veii, or simply following their own migratory impulse, met a Roman army at the Allia River. The Romans, confident in their new power, were shattered. The Celtic charge, the sheer noise and terror of it, broke the Roman legions, who fled in a panic so complete that the anniversary of the Battle of the Allia, the Dies Iter or Black Day, was forever marked as ill-omened on the Roman calendar. The Celts then marched on Rome itself and sacked it. But even in this, their moment of greatest triumph over the shadow, they misunderstood its nature. They besieged the Capitoline hill but, according to the legend, were bought off with a ransom of gold. They took the treasure and left. For a Celtic chieftain, this was a glorious victory. He had humiliated his enemy and taken their wealth, elevating his own status. He did not understand that he had not destroyed the Roman state. The Roman government, the core of its being, had survived on the Capitoline. The Celts had struck the body, but they had not severed the head. And a Roman never, ever forgot a defeat. The sack of Rome became not a memory of shame to be buried, but a rallying cry, a trauma that would fuel an unquenchable thirst for security through absolute domination. The shadow had been bloodied, but it had learned. It had felt the Celtic sword, and it would spend the next centuries ensuring it would never feel it again. The world of the Etruscans, the Celts, and Carthage, for all its brilliance, its diversity, its deep-rooted power, was now living on borrowed time, its fate silently being sealed by the grim, determined men who were even then, amidst the ashes of their city, rebuilding their walls, forging new swords, and looking north, south, and west with a cold, patient, and utterly terrifying hunger. Help me reach 7,000 subscribers. Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments.